Good day, Joe Simhart here again. It's 8/25, 2024, and again I'm responding to a request. Someone asked me to comment on psychedelics. I've mentioned them a few times before, but let's see where this goes. So to get started, let's have a drink and see what happens. So I've been interested in psychedelics since the 60s when they became a thing, especially by 1965. And I read some of the books, some of the literature back then. I didn't really try anything like LSD until 1967, and I stopped using entheogens or god drugs or psychedelics in 1975. And frankly, for two reasons. Because one, I found that the effects were getting boring, repetitive, and I thought maybe they might cause some harm if I kept using them. And I wasn't a heavy user, by no means. But I'm going to shrink this large topic down to mainly two things. And we're going to look at two psychedelic drugs that were the root of the great religions. One, Hinduism. The Rig Veda mentions the god, the plant, the drug Soma. And when we think of that, there's been a lot of speculation, for instance, about what exactly Soma was, but it's been in plain sight for 3,000 years. There's no real secret behind it. So let me give you a quick look at what it looked like. So that's Soma. It's a vine, and it's called Sinanchum acidum, right? And they used to pulverize it and turn it into a juice, and excuse me, and then do ceremonies and drink it. In the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Hindu scriptures, it says that the word Soma refers to a drink, a plant, and a deity. The Soma mandala of the Rig Veda is dedicated to Soma Pavamana, a ritual that involves pressing, straining, mixing, and pouring Soma with milk and water into containers. The Rig Veda also describes how drinking Soma can lead to immortality and how Indra and Agni consume large amounts of it. So Indra and Agni are separate god traditions, but they were fused in the Rig Veda. For example, in the Rig Veda 8.48.3, it is said that drinking Soma can lead to immortality, or Amrita. Rig Veda also describes how Indra drank large amounts of Soma while fighting the serpent demon Vritra. So it has a lot of different uses. Can turn you into a warrior as well as a mystic god being. And the quote is by the immortals. They said, "We have drunk the Soma, we have become immortal. We have gone to the light, we have found the gods." The ninth mandala of the Rig Veda is known as the Soma mandala. All right, so the other tradition, which has affected world religions in a really profound way, begins in the biblical Genesis story. And there's actually two stories that form Genesis, especially the creation. But in the creation of man part of it, we look at Genesis 15 to 17. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. So he was maybe like a farmer or a gardener. And the Lord commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die." And then the Lord said, "It is not good for man to be alone." And then he took a rib. Now there's from Adam, and it's a big dispute what that was, but the conclusion has been by a lot of scholars that it was really symbolic of the penis, that he used that to form the female. I'm not going to get into all that, but that was the rib. So the serpent tempts the female, and he says, "You surely shall not die if you eat of this fruit." She tasted it was good, and her eyes were opened, and then she tells Adam about it, and he tries it, and his eyes were opened, and then they became afraid because the Lord might find them, and they hid, and they made clothing for themselves out of leaves or some kind of vegetation there. And God, of course, he catches them and he says to them, well, he knows they've eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he says to them, why are you clothed? Who told you you were naked? That's significant, because the difference between the Soma drug, which is about enlightenment and becoming immortal, becoming one with the gods, living infinitely and eternally, becoming Brahman, the source of being, and this substance from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that added to man not immortality. Remember, you die if you eat this. So in one interpretation that I read, which is very good, from a book called The Worm at the Core, man basically noticed in hindsight that at some point he became very different than the animals, and he began to build shelters in a different way, use technology in a different way, and put clothing on. Animals don't do that. So there had to be a break from that Edenic state, the animal state, into the human state. And that break was the ability to judge reality, to make judgments about whether being naked was suitable because maybe it stimulated sexual thoughts or whatever that were inappropriate, and to hide those parts may have been useful to early man. But he certainly was changed from being an animal state now to something else. And he was condemned to die. What he died to was his animal nature. He became something akin to what Shakespeare called something between an angel and a man. In other words, more divine than animals, especially in his imagination. So that's two different traditions of drug use that led to some kind of enlightenment. In the one case, it led to our human nature. In the other case, it takes our human nature and allows us to become God nature. So two different versions of the drug experience. I remember reading somewhere years ago that up to 70% of what we call religious activity or religions, especially in ancient times, were stimulated by some kind of drug experience. I mean, it could have been anything like, mushrooms, alcohol was a big one, beers, wine, marijuana was around for a long time. It's also written about in the ancient Vedas. So these drug and ecstatic experience give us a sense of transcendence, get us in touch with the transcendent, and we give that names like God and the gods or deities or ancestors or whatever. So there's that. And the interesting mushroom that they thought was the Soma mushroom originally. So let me show you this, if you can see this quickly. There it is. It's the red spotted mushroom called the Amanita muscaria. And now I've tried that mushroom a couple of times back in the day, in the late 60s. And it's highly toxic. I got poisoned. I also had some interesting psychedelic experiences, but I wouldn't recommend using that thing without a lot of education and preparation as to what it is. Now, we all know that the mushroom is made famous in Alice in Wonderland, and most times it's portrayed as this Amanita muscaria, which is the fairy tale mushroom. But in that particular story, the psychedelic experience of Alice when she eats of the mushroom. One side makes her smaller, the other side makes her bigger. And of course, the hookah, the caterpillar, doesn't tell her which side does it, because there's no side to a mushroom. You could just keep going around it and not find it. But she just happens to tear off one with the right hand, one with the left hand. So the right-handed side did one thing and the left-handed side did another thing. Fairy tales can get away with anything. But what's interesting is there's an altered state of consciousness that goes on, and the altered state of consciousness creates the bigger Alice and the smaller Alice. It gives her a different perspective on reality and on who she is in reality. And that's what these substances do. The entheogens or psychedelics, they give us a different perspective on reality. Taste, color, feeling, the sense of movement. I remember on LSD, I was walking along, and I felt that I wasn't moving anywhere. I was standing still, and the earth was moving under me. So my sense of presence was still and in one place. I had this feeling that I would not die, that I was immortal at one point. I remember hugging a tree and laughing with it, and the whole tree shook with me, is how it felt, like it was alive and one with me. So all these things are profound when you're having the experience, but as soon as they wear off, you come back to the mundane world, and it's not so exciting. And in fact, in some cases, people can get quite derealized. I remember in college, friends of mine were experimenting with LSD in the late 60s, and one guy I knew, a year after he had this experience, he told me that he had died. He was still going to class, he was getting by, but he felt dissociated. He wasn't there as a person, so he was derealized. So the effects of the drug were uncanny on him. And another young lady I knew took these LSD one time, was found screaming in Los Angeles on the street, naked. She had to have up to 8 shock treatments because no treatment would work to bring her out of this crazy depression she was in over a period of a year. And at some point, even after she recovered and got married and got a nursing degree, had a baby, had postpartum depression, and she jumped from a building and committed suicide. And I point to her vulnerability, but also to LSD triggering this disturbance in her psyche. There's a lot of those stories. But when we look at these drugs, I mentioned that I thought they became boring. And when I read this book by Houston Smith, and I've heard him lecture, he was a philosopher of religions, a student of religions, and he wrote the book, The Religions of Man, which was very popular at one time. But in this book, he looks at entheogens, or God drugs, God substances, which he himself tried. And he has a positive spin and a negative spin on it. He tries to look at it realistically. But he says here something quite interesting in his conclusion. He said, I will myself stretch this line of thought to its conclusion. Even among those who are religiously responsible, entheogens appear to have, in the parlance of atomic decay, a half-life. Their revelations decline. They are also capricious, opening the gates of heaven at the start. There comes a time, and I can attest to this myself, when they begin to open either onto less and less or onto the demonic. So in other words, negative energies or negative perceptions start happening to the person. They get paranoid, right? People like Timothy Leary, for instance. He got really weird on this. So he said, it is precisely the opposite that the book that introduced the entheogens to the contemporary West, Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, was followed quickly by his Heaven and Hell. It seems that if God can manifest himself through anything, it is equally the case that nothing can commandeer him and guarantee his arrival. It is compatible with the notion that the Absolute entered India by way of a mushroom to hold that sometime later it stopped doing so. So yeah, at some point the Vedas don't talk about these drug experiences anymore, and yoga or meditative experience takes the place of the psychedelic experience. And what's interesting, in my generation, the 60s generation, the boomers, I noticed too that drug use had worn off by the early 70s. And like me, a lot of people just quit because they felt they were being harmed or it was making people crazy and they were getting bored with it. And many young people that found that with the drugs turned to the new religions. The Eastern religions were coming to the shores in the late 60s. The Jesus movement, which was drug-free, basically, the Jesus freaks, that was a big deal then. And drug use became anathema. You didn't need it. There were people I met who joined groups like the Divine Light Mission or the Hare Krishnas, and they were saying things like, you know, I am higher now than I ever was on drugs, you know, doing the Maha Mantra or getting the knowledge of DLM or whatever. So higher consciousness was really high. You know, we got really dosed up on consciousness raising back then. That kind of thing is still going on. I mean, it seems like there's been a revival of use of psychedelics, especially in the last 20 some years in the Silicon Valley. They were microdosing on this stuff. There's been a lot more research. Johns Hopkins University on using psilocybin especially, and maybe LSD. Sometimes one treatment can help people overcome a decade of depression when drugs aren't working for them, meaning antidepressants. It seems to relieve anxiety over death. When someone takes one trip, they feel better accustomed to dying if they have a terminal illness. So there are some uses for it. And, you know, my hippie generation noticed these things. They just couldn't legitimize them because this stuff's illegal. And you certainly could administer this sort of thing in a setting like a hospital or a PTSD clinic for soldiers. So there is some positive use, carefully done, but in general, I think these drugs, like Houston Smith states, have a half-life, and too much use for some people can lead to boredom and maybe something worse. And maybe even one use for some people can cause mental illness to be unmasked. And I noticed this in a mental hospital. Some people would come in after using mushrooms once, and maybe they were predisposed to psychosis through schizophrenia, but using the drug, a heavy dose of marijuana or some kind of an entheogen, could bring on the schizophrenia much earlier than it would have come on. And it also now causes a management problem because now it's fully flowering in the person and their mind has gone into psychosis. So, yeah, there's a lot of good books on this stuff. I recommend I Am Luce's Ecstatic Religion about shamanism. He does a really good job looking into this whole thing, does a sensible evaluation of that, I think. This one's not such a good book, but it was very popular, In Search of the Magic Mushroom by John Sanford. Basically, it's you know, kind of a hippie book, one I wouldn't recommend for scholars. Mysticism, Sacred and Profane by Zahner came out in 1957, was reissued in 67 with all the interest in the in psychedelics. Professor Zahner looks at mysticism, and in the last chapter he talks about his experiences with mescaline. Then there's a real good one, Storming Heaven by Jay Stevens, looks at the effects of the LSD culture and how it came about through the government and through Timothy Leary, and Ken Kesey with the Merry Pranksters is mentioned in here. LSD and the American Dream, Storming Heaven. You know, so we were looking to become free, and everything but freedom came out of that whole thing. We became enslaved to our limited understanding of our consciousness. And then there's the dark side of this whole thing with LSD and other drugs. This book, The Journey into Madness, by Gordon Thomas, the true story of secret CIA mind control and medical abuse. Good read. I remember reading this when it came out. When did it come out? Quite a bit ago. But yeah, Journey into Madness is worth taking a look at if you want to look at the downside of this. 1989. So with that said, I'm hoping I covered a little bit, but I wanted to mainly look at two traditions, two different approaches to awakening through some kind of a substance. The biblical one in Genesis, which led to us being human, not being divine, and the Soma one, which led to us being divine and escaping from human consciousness. So, okay, enjoy your day. Have a sip of whatever, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.